Today we'll be talking about Apollodorus of Athens. Apollodorus of Athens, son of Asclepiades, was a Greek scholar, historian, and grammarian. He was a pupil of Diogenes of Babylon. And his most important work is his account of the history of Greece from the earliest times down to his own day, or at least it would have been if it had survived, but it hasn't. Fortunately, however, large portions of it were preserved in the writings of others, especially in those of Plutarch, who frequently uses him as a source for the mythical and legendary periods. According to tradition, he died in Athens in 245 BC. The date of his birth is unknown. We know that he was born in Athens because he wrote an account of the history of that city from its legendary foundation up to the end of the 6th century BC. This he published separately, but used as part of his larger work, the Universal History of Greece. His Universal History of Greece is what we will be focusing on today. It appears that he intended to cover the entire Greek world, including, by the way, not only Greece proper, but also the Hellenic peoples beyond Greece proper, such as the Etruscans, for example. His work was titled Bibliotheca, which literally means library, though often rendered into English as something like historical library or book of history. The title may indicate that he conceived his work as a collection of historical writings just as a library contains a collection of books. Or perhaps the title was meant to convey that Greece itself is the subject matter of the work, since Greece was famously called the nurse and the educator of mankind, paideia. So the library then would metaphorically mean education. And indeed, Plutarch says of Apollodorus that his work aims to instruct the reader about the origins of the Greeks and their way of life. Like many other Greek historians, Apollodorus based his work on earlier sources, though it appears that he did so very heavily. Even when writing about the more recent past, he followed older writers. This is why only small portions of his work survived in the writings of others. The reason for this is that after his day, the works he used became canonical and his use of them was forgotten. Fortunately for us, one of these sources is Plutarch, whose work was popular in the Renaissance and thus preserved, even though most people at the time knew little or nothing of Plutarch's sources. In fact, during the Renaissance, Plutarch was usually considered to be a first-hand source, even though he was in reality a secondary source. By the way, Plutarch, though born a Roman citizen, spent most of his life in Greece. He must have been well acquainted with Apollodorus's work, since he repeatedly used him as a source. Other sources for Apollodorus include Athenaeus, who quotes him quite frequently, as well as a number of epigrams and other miscellaneous writings. Unfortunately, all these sources are second-hand, and since they quote Apollodorus only occasionally, it would appear that his work was mostly lost. However, several scholars believe that more of his work has survived in other writings than we realize, and that much of the pseudo-historical material scattered throughout Greek literature actually came from Apollodorus. But this is a rather controversial view. The surviving fragments of Apollodorus show him to have been a thorough and painstaking scholar. He doesn't appear to have had any strong opinions of his own, and seems to have simply done his best to present a coherent narrative out of the wealth but often conflicting material available to him. That said, he does seem to have been aware that much of his source material was legendary or mythical and not historical. Thus, whenever he came across a story that seemed far-fetched, he sometimes expressed doubt. For example, he thought that the story of Heracles was probably a myth, and he also doubted that the Athenians could really have once fought against the Persians under the leadership of Theseus. Similarly, he thought that the war with the Argives over the control of the Isthmus of Corinth was probably not as dramatic as it is presented by Hellanicus, the legendary historian whom he seems to have used as a main source for the early Archaic period. Even though he didn't write anything himself about prehistory, the framework of his history was probably derived from the works of Epictetus, who claimed to have written a history of the universe from the creation of the world down to his own day. According to Athenaeus, Apollodorus believed that Epictetus's history was true, though he himself was more skeptical. Still, Apollodorus thought that a knowledge of the prehistoric past was necessary for understanding Greek religion, and he included the relevant myths in his work. In particular, he wrote about the origins of the cosmos, the creation of the gods, the Titanomachy, the Gigantomachy, the origin of mankind, and the prehistory of Greece and the Greek peoples. For the most part, he retold the myths as they were told in the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, Hesiod's Theogony, and the Homeric poems. But he also used other sources, such as Stoicism and the Cypria. Of course, these myths were not history in the modern sense of the word, but neither were they mere mythology. Rather, they were part of what we might call proto-history, a kind of prehistorical narrative that served as a framework for understanding Greek civilization. In essence, Apollodorus, like other Greek historians, was writing about how the Greeks came to be civilized. He wanted to explain how their religion, customs, institutions, arts and sciences came into being. And he needed to go back to the origins of the world itself in order to do that. One might think that such an enterprise was pointless, but to the Greeks it wasn't. You see, the Greeks believed that the way a thing began was of the utmost importance. How something started determined how it developed. Thus, knowing the origins of things gave you insight into how they functioned. Hence, understanding the prehistory of the Greeks, their religion, their civilization, was crucial for making sense of Greek history. Unfortunately, as I said before, Apollodorus's history has not survived, except for a few fragments. Thus, we can't really say how well he succeeded in creating a coherent narrative out of all those disparate sources. But in the surviving fragments, he already wove together the Homeric, Hesiodic, and Stoicism accounts into a smooth and readable narrative. He could make anachronistic comments from time to time. Once he remarks that it is silly to say that the Greeks used to think that the earth was flat, since even the Thracians knew that it was round. Another time he says that one shouldn't take literally everything Hesiod said, since he was a rustic and not very sophisticated. Although Apollodorus seems to have regarded the prehistoric period as mythical and legendary, he held the view that the more recent past was real, or at least that it had a basis in reality. He thought that later Greek historians had made a mistake in leaving out the prehistory of Greece, despite its mythical and legendary character, because without it, there was no context for the rise of Greek civilization. And he lamented that the older histories of Greece began too late, in the middle of the first millennium BC. This is why he tried to fill the gap by writing his own prehistory of Greece. So whereas Greek historians before him had begun their histories in the middle of the first millennium BC, often with the first Olympic Games in 776 BC, Apollodorus went back to the origins of the world, explaining how everything began: the gods, the titans, the giants, the human race, and the Greek peoples, and how they migrated into Greece, where they eventually founded the various Greek states and settled the Peloponnese, the Aegean Islands, and the coast of Asia Minor. Then he described the Trojan War and the return of the Achaeans to Greece, after which he began to narrate Greek history proper. He covered the period from the end of the Archaic to the beginning of the Classical period, writing about the first Persian invasion of Greece, the rise of Sparta and Athens, the Greco-Persian Wars, the rise of Philip of Macedon and Alexander the Great, and the Wars of the Diadochi. From there, he continued down to his own day, writing about Rome and the rise of the Roman Republic. As I said before, we don't know exactly when Apollodorus lived, but it seems likely that he completed his work around 245 BC, since that was the year in which Athens minted coins bearing his name. Whether this means that he died that year or merely that this was the year in which he finished his work is uncertain. You can find more information about Apollodorus in my book, The Ancient Greek Historians. Thanks for watching.